October 13, 1972, the day a plane crashed in the Andes. What happened that day has an ambivalence. For some, it went down in history as the tragedy of the Andes. Others remember it as the miracle of the Andes. A horrific, unprecedented accident that became a symbol of survival and struggle. When everything was thought to be lost, hope became visible. However, the horror came when those who went through the dark journey told the experience in detail. Then, the faces of everyone who was following the news were filled with terror. Today, almost 50 years after it all happened, the story still chills the blood. And it is considered, in turn, one of the worst calamities to have occurred in the world of rugby. But what were the ordeals that the victims of the accident went through? How far is the human instinct capable of going in order not to surrender to a death that seems imminent? Before we begin this story, I kindly ask you to please leave your like below, subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications. Also, I invite you to leave a comment with suggestions for possible future videos. Let's begin. December 22nd, 1972. A humble man who was herding his cattle near the Barroso River saw someone signaling to him from the other side. They were two people waving their arms desperately. The name of the humble man was Sergio Hilario Catalan Martinez. He was born in 1929 in Chile and was the father of 9 children. He devoted his life to raising sheep. Sergio tried to understand what the men were saying to him, but the noise caused by the current of the water interfered with any kind of communication they tried to establish. However, something was quite clear to him: those men needed help. Their appearance was alarming. Sergio made a gesture to calm them down. Tomorrow, that was the message. Indeed, the next day he returned to the place. The individuals were still there. Sergio, this time better prepared, threw a stone to his interlocutors with a notebook and a pencil tied to it. The others took the stone and one of them started to write. When Sergio got the paper back, he turned pale. He couldn't believe what he was reading. I come from a plane that crashed in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. Isin, onin. 14 injured people remain in the plane. We have to get out of here quickly and we don't know how. We have no food. We are weak, please. We can't even walk. Sergio nodded his head. Then he threw them 4 loaves of bread and a promise. He was going to help them, no matter what it took. Without wasting any time, Sergio rode his horse at full speed for the 120 kilometers that separated him from Puente Negro, where there was a police checkpoint. Once there, he explained what had happened and they relayed the news to Santiago, where the message was received with disbelief. They even assumed that this man was drunk. Sergio insisted vehemently until someone ventured the following idea. What if it really was the people who had crashed in the plane more than 70 days ago? But it seemed impossible to believe. Who could survive first a plane crash and then the hostility of the Andes climate for such a long time? But what if it was them? Thanks to Sergio's tenacity, an operation was set in motion that would eventually rescue the survivors. A horrible odyssey was coming to an end that December, an odyssey that had begun on October 12th. The amateur rugby team Old Christian Club from Montevideo was going through a very good streak. They were going to face an English rugby team in Santiago, Chile, a unique opportunity to show how prepared they were to move up to the big leagues. Without hesitation, the club president, Daniel Juan, hired a Fairchild twin turboprop plane from the Uruguayan Air Force to fly to their destination. The aircraft FAU 571 was 4 years old and had 792 hours on its airframe. It would end up becoming sadly famous and would find its final resting place in the most unexpected location. The designated pilot was Colonel Julio Cesar Ferrada. Julio had flown across the Andes 29 times before. He was accompanied by co-pilot Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Lagurara. There were 10 additional seats, and the team members invited some friends and family to join them. The aircraft was carrying 40 passengers and 5 crew members. Before boarding, many prayed. These were very devout people, raised in the Christian faith. Of those 45 people who boarded, only 16 would survive. The rest would be tackled by fate. The aircraft departed from Carrasco International Airport on October 12, 1972, but a storm front over the mountains forced them to stop for the night in Mendoza, Argentina. The next morning, the conditions hadn't improved, but changes were expected in the early afternoon. The pilot waited and took off at 2:18 p.m. on Friday, October 13th. Some felt a brief chill, it was known. That's why Friday the 13th is considered in some parts of the world as a day of bad luck. However, it wasn't bad luck that ended up crossing the path of the rugby players. That day, bad luck was on the bench, misfortune took the field. And with an effective lineup of technical errors and also bad maneuvers, it took over the game. While they were flying, the clouds darkened the mountains. The pilots couldn't visually confirm their location, but they weren't alarmed either. They knew what they were doing and what they were facing, so they put their trust in radio navigation, and that's where their ordeal began. The pilot estimated that they were close to their destination and requested permission to descend from the other side. An operator located in Santiago authorized them. Neither the pilot nor the operator knew that the plane was actually far from its destination. The plane was still over the Andes, and by the time both parties realized it, it was too late. The Andes mountain range occupies the western region of South America, bordering its entire Pacific Ocean coast. It is 8,500 kilometers long, making it the longest continental mountain range on Earth. It has a variable width between 250 and 750 kilometers. It covers an area of approximately 2,870,000 square kilometers. Its average height is between 3,000 and 4,000 meters above sea level. It is home to the highest volcanoes on the planet, and its highest point is Aconcagua, whose 6,962 meters above sea level make this mountain the highest on the planet. Outside of Asia, due to its significant volcanic activity, it is part of the Pacific Ring of Fire. The Andes, moreover, is the main setting of this story. At first, the turbulence was a source of laughter for the bravest ones. Seconds later, the aircraft's ground collision alarm went off. Whispered prayers echoed throughout the cabin as the underside of the aircraft's tail cone struck the crest of a mountain at 4,200 meters. Then another impact, and suddenly the plane lost its right wing completely, with such force that the vertical stabilizer was torn off along with it. The rest happened very quickly. The impacts tore off the rear part of the fuselage, including 2 rows of seats, the galley, and the baggage compartment. 3 passengers, the navigator, and the flight attendant were thrown out along with the tail section into the void. The aircraft continued moving forward, still at high speed, causing a third collision that tore off the left wing, resulting in 2 more deaths. The fatally mutilated plane continued its trajectory through the air before sliding down a steep slope at 350 kilometers per hour until it crashed into a snowbank. Finally, it would come to a stop on a glacier at an altitude of 3,570 meters in the department of Malaru, province of Mendoza. The glacier didn't have a name at that time. Over time, it was named the Glacier of Tears. At least 4 more people died from the impact against the snowbank. The pilot died instantly when the nose of the plane was pushed back by the force of the impact, crushing the instrument panel against his chest. The co-pilot was also trapped. He screamed for someone to find his gun and shoot him. No one dared to do it. He died shortly after. Another passenger staggered out of the accident but fell into deep snow and suffocated. 33 people survived, although many were seriously injured. None of the passengers with compound fractures survived. Roberto Canessa, a second-year medical student, acted quickly to assess the severity of people's injuries and treat those who had the best chances of survival. Nando Parado suffered a skull fracture and remained in a coma for 3 days. They didn't know it at the time, but Canessa and Parado would end up being essential for bringing that whole nightmare to an end. However, that was still a long way off. The Chilean Air Search and Rescue Service was notified that the flight was missing. 4 planes searched the area until nightfall. They called the Chilean Andes Rescue Group. On the second day, 11 planes from Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay searched for the downed flight. The survivors saw them fly by, but immediately realized that the mist and snowstorms made it impossible for them to be seen. They looked for something to write with on the damaged fuselage. They found lipstick and improvised a faint "Save Our Souls," which was soon covered up. With indescribable anguish, they watched the rescue planes fly away. Eager not to give up, they searched through the wreckage until they found a small transistor radio. Without wasting any time, they improvised an antenna and, through the interference, were able to listen to the news. Day after day, they looked at the sky and listened to pilots of various nationalities talk about how sooner or later they would be found, that it was only a matter of time. They tried to stay upbeat until they heard a statement broadcast on October 21st. After searching the area for a total of 142 hours and 30 minutes, the searchers concluded that there was no hope and they called off the search. They clarified that they expected to find the bodies in the summer when the snow melted. The passengers removed the broken seats and other debris from the aircraft and created an improvised shelter measuring 2.5 by 3 meters. To try to protect themselves from the cold, they removed the seat covers, which were partially made of wool. To avoid snow blindness, they made sunglasses using the sun visors from the pilot's cabin. They used the seat cushions as snowshoes. As the hours went by, the deaths kept adding up. Everything kept getting more and more complicated, but the worst part was the hunger. There was no natural vegetation, and there were no animals either on the glacier or on the nearby mountain. The survivors had very little food, 8 chocolate bars, a can of mussels, 3 small jars of jam, a can of almonds, candies, dried plums, and several bottles of wine. During the days following the accident, they divided them into very small portions so that their scarce supply would last as long as possible. However, even with that strict rationing, their food stock quickly dwindled. The group, desperate and in need of calories, tried to eat parts of the plane, like the cotton inside the seats and also the leather, but they only ended up getting sick. It was then that the idea for which they would later be judged began to cross their minds. Most of the dead were classmates, close friends, or family members, so it was twice as hard to accept Canessa's proposal. If they wanted to survive, they had to resort to eating the flesh of those who had died. As a medical student, Canessa saw the corpses not as friends or family, but as a source of protein that could be their salvation and that of the others. The level of religiosity among the others made them recoil in horror just by considering the possibility. Canessa, tough by nature and only 19 years old, decided to stop arguing and take action. Using broken glass from the plane's windshield as a cutting tool, he set the example by swallowing the first strip of frozen meat. Many continued to refuse for a few days, others took time to keep the human meat down in their stomachs, but little by little, everyone understood there was no other option. At first, they could only eat skin, muscles, and fat. When the supply of meat ran low, they also ate hearts, lungs, and even brains. 17 days after the accident, near midnight on October 29th, an avalanche hit the plane where the survivors were sleeping, filled the fuselage, and killed 8 people. The survivors soon realized that they were running out of air. Nando Parado found a metal pole from the overhead luggage racks and was able to make a hole in the roof, providing ventilation. For 3 days, the survivors were trapped in the extremely tight space, along with the bodies of those who had died in the avalanche. When the snow that had buried the fuselage gradually melted with the arrival of summer, the passengers went outside and made a decision. They couldn't go on like this anymore. Some members would go look for help. The survivors had already made several brief expeditions in the vicinity of the aircraft in the first weeks after the accident. But they found that altitude sickness, dehydration, snow blindness, malnutrition, and the extreme cold at night made traveling any significant distance an impossible task. When the weather conditions improved, they tried again. December the 12th, 1972. 2 months after the accident, Parado, Canessa, and Vicintin began to climb the mountain to the west. They lacked technical equipment, a map, a compass, and any climbing experience. They carried an improvised sleeping bag and a single conviction: there was not much left to do. They would inevitably die if they didn't find help, both them and the others. The 3 men could see that the walk was going to take much longer than they had originally planned. They were running out of food, so Vicintin agreed to return to the crash site. The return was completely downhill, and using an airplane seat as an improvised sled, he went back to the crash site. Before continuing, Parado and Canessa talked for a long time. They were both straightforward and realistic. They knew they were walking toward the end. There was no turning back now. It was either make it or perish. In the attempt, they shook hands, knowing they were sealing their fate. Parado and Canessa walked for several days. When their strength faltered, they encouraged each other. Gradually, signs of human presence increased along the way. First, some evidence of camping. Finally, on the 9th day, some cows. It was then that they went out to gather firewood and met none other than the muleteer, Sergio Hilario Catalan Martinez. When the news broke that people had survived the crash of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, international reporters began walking several kilometers along the route from Puente Negro to Termas del Flaco. The Chilean Air Force provided 3 Bell UH-1 helicopters to assist with the rescue. Under normal circumstances, the search and rescue team would have brought back the remains of the dead for burial. However, given the circumstances, the Chilean rescuers decided to leave the bodies at the site until the authorities could make the necessary decisions. The survivors held a press conference on December 28 at the Estela Maris School in Montevideo, where they recounted the events of the previous 72 days. To their surprise, they received a negative public reaction because of the cases of cannibalism. But after they explained the pact the survivors had made to sacrifice their flesh if they died to help the others, the outcry diminished and the families became more understanding. The authorities and the victims' families decided to bury the remains near the crash site in a mass grave near the tomb. They built a simple stone altar and placed an orange iron cross on it. They placed a plaque on the pile of rocks with the inscription, "The world to its Uruguayan brothers." They doused the remains of the fuselage with gasoline and set it on fire. Only the charred frame remained. The father of a victim had received news from a survivor that his son wished to be buried at home. Unable to obtain official permission to recover the body, he organized an expedition on his own with hired guides. Upon his return with the remains, he was arrested for grave robbing. A federal judge and the local mayor intervened to secure his release. Canessa currently works as a pediatric cardiologist and motivational speaker. In 2016, he wrote the book I Had to Survive. In 2019, the former army commander, Guido Manini Rios, offered Canessa the candidacy for the vice presidency of the Republic for the Cabildo Abierto party, but Canessa declined it. Parado later developed other businesses and became a television host in 2006. The families of the passengers of Flight 571 built a black obelisk at the crash site and created the Viven Foundation to preserve the memory of the victims. The rescued people formed a strong bond with Sergio and his children, to the point of calling them Papa Sergio and brothers. In July due to osteoarthritis in his right hip that he had been suffering from for some time, Sergio needed surgery to have a prosthesis implanted. It was his Uruguayan children who, with their contribution, financed the cost of the operation. They also offered him help when 5 years later, in 2012, he had to undergo surgery again. Sergio passed away at the age of 91 in Puente Negro on February 11, 2020. His remains rest in the Parque San Fernando Cemetery. His tombstone omits this detail. For 16 people, he will always be remembered as a hero. And that's it for today's video. I hope you found this case interesting since it was requested, this story about the accident in the Andes. If you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. I'll leave you a couple of recommendations so you can keep binge watching on this channel. You can also leave a comment here, suggesting possible future videos. With nothing more to add, I bid farewell. I'm Magnus Mephisto, and this was The Day That. Goodbye. Thank you for watching the video.